Good morning. I'm Rob Stavins. I've already had an opportunity to meet with all of you, I guess the day before yesterday. As you know, there are 3 forum events being scheduled that are part of spring exercise this year. The first one you already participated in, the Science of Global Climate Change. And next Monday, the third one will take place on international politics of global climate change policy. And that enables us today to focus on the economic dimensions of global climate policy. And for this purpose, we have assembled a very distinguished panel of authorities. So I'm going to introduce them to you now in alphabetical order, and I'm going to keep my own participation to a minimum. First of all, Jeffrey Frankel is the James W. Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth here at the Kennedy School of Government. Jeff also directs the Program in International Finance and Macroeconomics at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Importantly for our purposes in these 2 weeks is that Jeff was appointed by President Clinton to the Council of Economic Advisors in 1996, and he served there until March of 1999. And at CEA, his responsibilities included international economics, macroeconomics, and the environment. And if you think about an issue that is at the nexus of those 3 areas, it's global climate policy. In fact, he was centrally involved in the Clinton administration's thinking about global climate policy and developing the U.S. response to the Kyoto Protocol. His PhD in economics is from MIT. Henry Jacoby, our next panelist, is the William F. Pounds Professor of Management at MIT's Sloan School. In addition, Jake is the co-director of the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Climate Change. He's been involved in economic analyses of climate change policies for more than 2 decades, going back to his service on some seminal National Academy of Sciences committees that were convened in the 1970s. Jake is the co-author of a broad-ranging critique of the Kyoto Protocol that appeared in Foreign Affairs and that I would mention is in your notebook of readings. And in fact, while I mentioned that, there are writings by all of the panelists in your notebook of readings. Next, Daniel Lashoff is a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the nation's leading environmental advocacy groups with some 350,000 members. At NRDC, Dan specializes in global warming, energy policy, and environmental science. Before joining NRDC, he worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He's testified frequently on global climate change and on energy policy, both before federal legislative bodies and many state and regulatory bodies as well. He holds a PhD degree from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. And since I omitted the degree, I should mention, particularly to this audience, that Jake Jacoby's PhD in economics and also his master's degree in public administration are from Harvard. Finally, let me turn to Mike Toman. He is a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, a Washington-based research institution. At RFF, Mike directs the Energy and Natural Resources Division, and he also directs RFF's Climate Economics and Policy program. From 1994 to 1996, he was a senior staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, where he had an opportunity to work on global climate policy as well as a variety of other environmental issues. His PhD in economics is from the University of Rochester. So in order to allow for some interaction among the panelists and maximum amount of time for questions from all of you and responses and discussion, we're going to begin with just brief 5-minute opening statements from each of the panelists. We're going to just go right down in alphabetical order. And then we're going to circle around a second time for a 2-minute follow-up in case any of the panelists have some comments they'd like to make further, particularly in response to what they heard from the others. And then we're going to go to Q&A. And about 10 minutes before closing time, we'll then give an opportunity for each of the panelists to provide some closing thoughts. And I'll pose a specific question for that later. So with that, let's begin with Jeff Frankel.
Thanks, Rob. Imagine that you are a graduate of the Mars School of Public Policy, and you come down to planet Earth in in March 2000, and you know all about the science of planetary warming. Let's say you're from the Venus School of Public Policy, so you know how it works, and you've also studied economics, and you notice that there've been you read that or hear that there've been big fluctuations in climate. There have been hot summers, and you also hear that the price of oil has tripled on planet Earth in the last year. And you think, great, this is a planet that really has its public policy act together. It's decided to raise the price of energy in order to discourage use of fossil fuels and cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. You go back home and report that. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the way it's been happening. In all the public talk lately about the recent increase in the price of home heating oil and gasoline, I have not heard or read one single mention that this even might be a potentially beneficial side effect for the environment from higher energy prices. And to the contrary, candidate Gore has attacked candidate Bush for having candidate Gore for having supported a measly 4.3 cent gasoline tax in 1993. And no one makes any connection to climate change. Climate change policy is debated in a separate category. It's a very polarized debate, distressingly polarized. On the one hand, you hear people say that this will be ruinously expensive, the Kyoto Protocol, damaging to the economy. You hear that from a lot of people in the Senate, from some business. You hear it a lot from labor. And on the other hand, you hear that we can address the problem without any cost whatsoever. We can save money and save energy at the same time. We hear that from some wishful thinking environmentalists and certain kinds of engineering modelers. According to the economic models, the truth is in between those two polar extremes. There's a lot of suspicion of economic models. People say these formal quantitative models. They can say anything. Some say the costs are high, some say they're low, so therefore there's nothing to be learned from them. One of the key points I'd like to get across is that the mainstream economic models, in fact, when they give different estimates of the costs, that's mainly because they're asking different questions. And if you're asking a different question, you should get a different answer. If you ask the question, what would be the cost of implementing Kyoto without international trading or without developing country participation, of course that cost would be much higher than if you ask what is the cost with full international trading, because that would allow us to attain the targets much more efficiently. Rob mentioned when I was in the administration, we released the Administration Economic Analysis. It's in your binder, but here's what the original looks like. This was a year ago, explaining the Kyoto Protocol to Congress and our economic rationale for it. And the really key pages in that document are in your binder are pages 270 to 274. The key bottom line was that in qualitative terms, given key elements actually in the agreement and in the President's policies regarding climate change, and that includes tradable permits and other flexibility provisions, the impact on the U.S. economy of the Kyoto Protocol, if it were adopted, would likely be modest. There isn't time to go through all the details that I mean there, but I hope you by now have encountered the terms when flexibility, what flexibility, and where flexibility, which is the flexibility to implement a given environmental goal as is most efficient with regard to when the cuts are distributed over time, which gases are cut and the role for sinks, and especially where the cuts take place. It is far cheaper to accomplish some of the reductions by paying other countries, and especially developing countries, to make reductions relative to their business as usual path than to do all the costs domestically. We did not do a full cost benefit analysis, much as we would have liked to, because we found it was just too difficult for all kinds of reasons to put a single monetary estimate on the cost of climate change and therefore the benefits of averting it. Instead, we made estimates of what were the costs of the targets that were actually agreed at Kyoto. We used there are a lot of good models out there. We used the SGM model of Battelle Labs because it was well suited to address international trading and because it was handy. And we found that trading among Annex I countries reduced costs by about a half. If developing countries were included in the system and we could trade with them, that reduced cost by 80%, relative to a situation where we tried to implement all the reductions domestically. And that got the costs, the economic costs of implementing Kyoto down to a range which I think is modest. I'd even call it low under those assumptions. Namely, $12 billion a year would be the resource costs, which is about 0.1% of GDP in the year 2010. The effect on the price of carbon was $23 a ton, which, for example, would raise the price of fuel oil by 5 to 9 cents, raise the price of gasoline by 4 to 6 cents a gallon. Is actually quite small compared to fluctuations that go on in the economies all the time. Some people, when they read the report, assumed, oh, we must have stacked the deck. This model we used must have given very low cost. But that's not the case, because the other models, whether it's Jake Jacoby's or other people's, show broadly similar results. The SGM model was actually in the middle of the pack regarding these cost estimates. In some ways, the numbers that I've cited are optimistic. In some ways, they're pessimistic. They're optimistic because they assume that we're implementing it in a market-friendly, efficient way, such as through a system of domestic tradable permits, where the requirement to cut emissions is imposed upstream, because that's a place where you can actually have some hope of enforcing it, and where the permits are tradable. It assumes full international trading, which the Europeans are opposed to, and it assumes participation by developing countries, where they'll limit their reductions to business as usual path, and we have the option of paying them, and they have the option of being paid to reduce their emissions below that. If you don't get those assumptions, then the cost will go up. If you don't have international trading, the cost will go up sixfold. In other respects, these estimates are conservative. We didn't allow for sinks. We just left it out because it was hard to model, and we'd rather just be explicit about that. We didn't factor in the benefits of the federal electricity restructuring legislation, which would save money, have a beneficial effect on the individual household's fuel bill that's on the same order of magnitude as the increases. We were very conservative about our assumption about the benefits you get in this short time frame from additional spending on research and development, as the President has proposed, largely following John Holdren's suggestions, and part of which has been funded by Congress, but not all. So I'll save the rest of my comments for the 2 minutes I get later, but just to conclude by saying the costs are not zero. This will not be a net economic benefit, but the cost can be kept low and quite manageable if it's done in a market-friendly way, both domestically and with regard to international trading.
Thanks. And let's turn to Jake Jacoby.
Okay, I'll make 4 points. I have to make one anticipating point for the 2 minutes I get later, which is that we have a statement in my household that goes as follows: if we had some ham, we could have a ham and cheese sandwich if we had some cheese. We'll come back to that. I want to make 4 points. First, this is a stock pollutant problem. That is, what matters in the climate issue is emissions over a century. The precise timing is not insignificant, but not crucial to the effects that might be created by global climate change. That means that the problem we're trying to resolve here, this one? Yeah. The problem we're trying to resolve here is a sequential decision under huge uncertainties in growth and emissions and technology, growth in technology and emissions, uncertainty in the climate system, which you've already talked about, uncertainty in the economic and environmental effects. So, given that this is a sequential decision, we're going to be making this decision over and over and over for the rest of my lifetime and for the rest of your lifetime. The key aspect now is to get the right system in place, one that can be robust over time and that can adjust to changing conditions. That's the first point. Second point is we already have a lot of the architecture that we're going to use to approach this system. This is what I would call the Rio Berlin architecture. There are other systems that one can imagine, maybe ones that we might prefer, but we have one that's in place. And we're likely to continue with it at least for a period of time that's relevant to the discussions that you're going to have. What is that? National targets and timetables with short-term, with targets that are relatively short period of time in the future, that is 5 to 10 years, a set of rolling negotiations, negotiating over and over again, where the history doesn't necessarily matter very much. That is, when you start the new negotiation for the new commitment period, what happened in the history is going to be history. What's going to matter is the economic conditions at that time. Arguments about about adequacy, about how much we should take on at each stage as we go forward are going to be influenced by a vague concept of stabilization in the atmosphere, which is the result of a meta-benefit cost analysis, which will go on as a subject of debate throughout this. That will condition the discussion. We're going to allow flexibility mechanisms that are going to allow trading among nations, given these targets, in various ways: formal trading, joint implementation, CDM. That's the architecture we've got. There are two main missing pieces: the accession of less developed countries and enforcement mechanisms. Now, that's the second point. We already have an architecture within which we're going to work, I think. Now, what about the Kyoto targets? What about the numbers that were adopted within this architecture? Well, what are they? I will give you the chance to calibrate these economic studies that we make by pointing out that the United States has accepted a target of 7% below 1990. We are already 17% above 1990. So even today, we're talking about reducing carbon or all gas emissions, and presumably carbon emissions would have to take their fair share of by about a quarter. By 2010, which is the midpoint of the commitment period, we're talking about the United States being maybe say 25 to 30% above 1990, and you add the 7% reduction, we're talking about a reduction of about a third or more, which would imply a reduction of that quantity in some combination of gases, and probably imply a reduction of that quantity in energy. The point is that these are major changes, and these changes are possible even without the trading. If you have a long period of time, if you have 20 years to do this, and you have efficient policies, then I agree it could be done at a cost that would be reasonable, that the economy could bear. Depending on the estimates range from 1 to 3% of the GDP. I think in round numbers, it's useful to think of, if you don't have a really efficient international trading scheme, the costs are roughly of the order of all other environmental cleanup. Or you could think of it over a 10-year period, it might be to lose 1 or 2 years growth. Whether you think that's big or not, you could talk growth in income. Whether you think that's big or not is a question we can discuss. With international trading, it could be substantially lower than that, as we pointed out. The point is that now, although there's a discussion of the trading system, the commitment to the Kyoto type of reductions, if they don't come until right the day before, in effect the day before the commitment period, like well after the year 2000, it's simply not credible. So that sooner or later we're going to have to start talking about what we're going to do with the numbers that have been written into the architecture. That is, my view is these numbers were picked in 1997 as in a circumstance driven by the local political concerns. There was no domestic support for this in the United States and in many other countries. And we could have a discussion of how cynical this was, but we have a number which is not going to work. So people say Kyoto is dead. A discussion we might have is here, and that you will need to deal with, is what is Kyoto? If Kyoto is dead, then what is Kyoto, and what do you mean by dead? A lot of what was in the Rio, Berlin, Kyoto system is not dead, but the numbers have to be reconsidered. This means that as we approach the next event in this drama, which is the COP6 meeting next fall, COP6 in my mind is kind of a shorthand for continuing negotiations. It's not the end of anything. It's a next step in something. We don't know how much would like to be resolved there, but many important things won't. So the next event, what is important on the economics of this for the next event? I think you have two choices in dealing with this impasse that we're going to come to about the ratification and going into force of Kyoto. We can either fix it or we can fudge it. And there are people on both sides of that, to fix it or fudge it. Fudge it is to loosen up the sinks definitions, to loosen up the CDM definitions, add a lot of creative accounting, lots of hot air, and make it look really, really cheap. To fix it would be to deal actually with the rethinking of the targets that were chosen. So my recommendations for issues that have to be dealt with as we go forward is to keep the sinks rules realistic, to have sensible trading rules that will allow development over the 20 years that it will take to develop this system, to have an enforcement system which can support a trading system. We'll come back to why enforcement is important for trading. And then finally, to open up the question this question of targets and timetables, which has to be reconsidered, and to pry open the accession issue. So COP6, and this we're in a long process, and I think we're going to have to open up this agreement to admit that some parts of Kyoto are dead, and see how we can save the rest of it.
Thank you, Jake. Let's turn to Dan Lashoff.
Thanks. I'd like to start with a few global and abstract observations and move to more concrete and specific points, and I'll try to make 8 points in 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster. One, I think that both the benefits and cost of solving the problem of stabilizing greenhouse gases over the long term, as called for by the convention which was ratified, is not only uncertain but actually unknowable in a fundamental sense. On the benefit side, I think this is because we simply can't know how future generations will, for example, value intact natural ecosystems. On the cost side, I think this is because the global energy economy is path dependent, so that as we start down a particular path and make investments, it changes technology and it changes all the future evolution of costs from that point forward. My second point is, therefore, as Jake Jacoby said, we are in a process of decision making that, while it should be guided by a long-term goal, has to, in fact, be iterative in nature. Third point, I believe that given the risks of irreversible harm from global warming, our near and midterm decisions needed to be guided by the goal, at a minimum, of maintaining the option of stabilizing greenhouse gases at well below the equivalent of doubling from pre-industrial levels, say at around 450 parts per million. Point 4, to do this, stabilizing greenhouse gases at, say, 450 parts per million means that total fossil fuel carbon emissions over the next century need to be roughly limited to 500 to 600 gigatons of carbon. Again, as Jake Jacoby said, it's a stock problem. And that may suggest that there's a lot of flexibility about when you make the reductions to stay within that budget. But I would submit that in practice, the when flexibility is actually pretty limited because there's really a rather narrow safe landing corridor that you have to stay in if you want to get to stabilization at that level. When you consider the sort of inherent time frames in the system, both for bringing developing countries in on some kind of equitable basis and in terms of the practical limits on the rate of global change. So while you could do an economic model that says, based on discounting, if we wait 30 years and then reduce emissions really fast, it's cheaper than starting now, I don't think that is really a credible solution. Point 5. Clearly, all major emitters must eventually take part in emissions limitation regimes. But if you think about the basis for allocating emissions on a global basis, the only long-term credible way to do that, I believe, is some kind of convergence towards equal per capita allocations in terms of the initial allocation, not in terms of where the emission reductions would actually take place. by, say, the year 2050, just to pick a date. Ironically, while the U.S. has been the chief advocate of so-called developing country participation, it's also the most resistant to discussing per capita allocation of emission allowances for the obvious reason that U.S. per capita emissions are about 5 times the global average. Point 6, turning to more specific policy issues that we're facing with respect to Kyoto. I conclude from this that Kyoto is a modest but vital first altitude adjustment to stay within a safe landing corridor towards stabilization. And how significant a step it really is going to depend on the decisions made at COP6 and subsequently on some of the issues we've heard about in terms of emissions trading, the CDM, and the treatment of sinks or land use change and forestry. And that's fundamentally because the rules that are adopted for those flexibility mechanisms will determine the extent to which countries can inflate their emission budgets based on business as usual activity. And we can go into more detail on that later. But I think a key point is that while the idea of flexibility and stringency are usually separated in theory, they're almost always confounded in practice. How the flexibility mechanisms work will also influence the stringency of the regime. Now, in terms of how difficult it is to meet Kyoto, point 7, I agree with the basic conclusion of the CA analysis that the costs are modest, but for rather different reasons. I think the CAA analysis is rather optimistic about the availability of low-cost emissions trading and includes to some extent trading in essentially business as usual tons. But I think they're much too pessimistic about the availability of cost-effective emission reductions that arise from analyzing end-use opportunities to increase efficiency by overcoming microeconomic barriers. Now, I'll conclude with my 8th point and go out on a limb. I think if reasonable rules are adopted that maintain the integrity of the Kyoto Protocol, essentially some compromise, a little bit of fudging, but not too much, and the U.S. adopts an integrated emission control strategy involving both an upstream emissions trading system and targeted end-use strategies to overcome market barriers, I'd suggest that both the costs will be modest overall, possibly positive for the economy, but they're all, and I think the marginal price of allowances will be somewhere in the range of $25 to $50 a ton of carbon, somewhat higher than CEA suggests. But not anywhere close to what opponents have suggested. And I think that marginal cost will be driven by the cost of replacing about 1/3 of the existing coal-fired capacity or coal-fired electricity generation in the U.S. By new natural gas combined cycle generation that has an emission rate that's about 60% lower per kilowatt hour. And if you look into most models that provide any detail in the sector, this is where the marginal reductions can come from in the U.S. economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And finally, to Mike Toman.
Thanks, Rob. I know that in your book you have some things from the website WeatherVane that RFF maintains for disseminating climate information. I hope you have a chance to use that site. It's not just our stuff, but a lot of people's stuff. So I hope that's of some use to you as you go through this really interesting process. Jeff starts off by noting how contentious this process is. Jake notes that there are major issues related to both the targets and developing country participation. Dan lays out a very ambitious and pretty broad-ranging agenda for action over a long period of time, which I think is actually the right way to think about this issue. Because I'm not that imaginative, I'm going to focus on some much more near-term things, and I'm going to try to emphasize whether there is, in fact, despite the contentiousness that Jeff noted, some possibility for convergence in policy and attitude over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, though probably not before we go to The Hague this fall. I'll start with 3 points that may be self-evident, but I think still need to be underscored. This is speaking now as an economist. Looking at this issue, I would make the following observations. There are a lot of uncertainties about the benefits and costs, but I would say this. First, I think we know enough about the risks of climate change to say that it's an issue that demands some action, not just further study about the risks. We need a whole portfolio of actions that include greenhouse gas reductions, development of new technology, and international cooperation to engage the developing world in their own self-interest as well as in the global interest. Secondly, costs do matter. I'll come back to this in a minute, but we can't simply talk about the environmental risks and not talk about the costs of action, or else I think we're dealing in a non-credible way. Third, there are a lot of things that matter about the world environment besides climate change. This is especially important in the way that the U.S. and other developed countries try to engage developing countries, and I think this issue is too often swept aside. A lot of developing countries have a lot of big environmental problems, and I think we're trying to force our agenda on them too much, and that's something that we ought to give some very serious thought to. So finally, in this preamble part, what do we know about the targets and timetables? I kind of come down with Jake on this in thinking that from the economic point of view, Kyoto is asking a little too much, a little too soon. I think while there's views on both sides of this, there is a fairly substantial body of evidence that convinces me that we should be taking a more gradual approach, starting with less ambitious targets and accelerating over time to try to hit long-term goals. It is true that the range of options available can be limited, especially if we're trying to stabilize the atmosphere at 450 parts per million, as Dan suggests. That range of options opens up a bit if we're willing to take whatever environmental risks might come about from, say, 550 or 650. And there's a lot of room for debate on that point, I'd say. A lot of uncertainty, but a lot of room for different calls. So where does this leave us in terms of some policy issues? Well, I think we're going to need some flexibility over the next few years to get anywhere. That's already self-evident in the political debates, not just in this country, but in Europe. Recent papers have come out of Germany suggesting that they're beginning to wonder, can we make our targets? And they've been among the leaders within the EU in pushing for aggressive targets. So if the Germans are questioning the feasibility of this, we should all be stepping back and thinking hard about what we're really setting ourselves up for. So what can we do? Not turning our back on this problem, not sort of wrecking the international negotiating architecture, but also acknowledging the realities of what it is we can accomplish. Well, one path we can take, which I think is a good path, is to try to take the Kyoto mechanisms and make them work as well as possible. In this respect, there's been a large debate going on between the U.S. and other members of the so-called umbrella group with the EU about whether the use of these mechanisms should be restricted. To sort of put this in soundbite terms, I think they shouldn't be, and I think we need to stand fast on that point. Otherwise, we're going to end up taking a lot more cost and getting no real benefit out of the deal. Secondly, I think that we need to be looking at ways we can deal with the realities of the targets and how we can make them work without making the whole thing into a sham exercise. Here I think there needs to be some serious thought given to possibilities that are being considered already in some quarters in the United States and may have some international relevance. The idea here is that we set up these targets, they're lofty, they're ambitious but very well-intended aspirations. It's good if we can get them, and if Dan is right and there's a lot of low-cost carbon reduction out there, we will get them. But if we can't, we need to find ways to provide some insurance against the possibility of excessively high costs. My colleagues and I at RFF have suggested an approach for domestic emission reductions where we would start with a comprehensive upstream emissions trading program, but we would combine it with a safety valve, a ceiling price on permits that is a policy-determined variable, one that could rise over time, so that we're really capping the cost of these programs, getting more political buy-in, but still trying to legitimate the idea that we need to move ahead. I strongly believe the U.S. should be doing this domestically in advance of the Kyoto window, both to demonstrate leadership and to prepare the way for a more ambitious reduction program in the future. But I equally well think that we should be having some serious debate about this same mechanism internationally. We need to start thinking about how we can get agreement on something that balances the aspirations of the targets and the reality of what a lot of countries in the Annex I developed world, not just the U.S., are going to be willing to accept in practice in terms of cost. I'd like to see that discussion start at The Hague, and I'd like to see it make progress thereafter. Finally, over the long term, I think we do need to have a more thoughtful and well-intentioned interaction with developing countries. The Clean Development Mechanism gives us a means to do that. And I think we need to move beyond the polarized rhetoric that's existed on that, where one faction says it's a very leaky mechanism, you can't really count the tons well. Another says this is a gigantic giveaway program. We need to find a way to actually make this a reasonably good but not perfect way of getting carbon reductions. We need to have a system in which we're doing some experimenting to learn about what opportunities really are in developing countries. And most of all, from my perspective, we need to have this be in the self-interest of developing countries, not just in our interest, because that's where the real deal is going to lie. There's a large latent demand out there in the developing world to start getting productively engaged in this. And if we meet them halfway, I think we can accomplish something useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, actually, you finished with time left, so in keeping with the theme of the discussion, you can either bank those minutes for later or sell them to a fellow panelist, as you choose. Before we now go around a second time, but more briefly with 2-minute responses, I wanted to just comment on one thing that Mike Toman said, because it bears upon spring exercise, and he referred to the RFF website and encouraged you to go there. I don't know if Sheila Burke and Jack Donahue were in the room, but if they were, they'd be wincing, because as you know, the ground rules about spring exercise is that you limit your research to the 1,200-page notebook and not go beyond that. The reason we do that, of course, is to avoid what would be the race to the bottom of all your available waking time during the next 2 weeks. I assure you that all of the things that Mike mentioned, including the domestic and the international versions of the safety valve mechanism, are in the notebook, in fact, from the RFF website. So,
sorry, mea culpa.
Quite all right. It was good that you did that, because it gave me an opportunity to reinforce that message. And with that, we go to Jeff Frankel.
Very, very restrictive to have to stick to these mere 1,000 pages in the briefing book. I started by mentioning this graduate of the Public Policy School of Venus, who comes down to Earth and is quite encouraged because she sees that we've reacted to a couple of hot summers by negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, and here we've raised the price of fossil fuels, and so we really have our act together. The reason why the reality is much less positive than that is due, in my view, to 5 large political chasms that have to be bridged if we're going to get anywhere. The first one is the chasm between the Congress, majority or many people in the Congress, and environmentally concerned citizens and scientists regarding whether the problem is genuine. There are many in Congress who still don't really believe we have to do something about this. I don't see how that gap is going to be bridged. Second, there's a chasm between the extent of popular concern on the one hand and popular unwillingness to bear even a moderate or small increase in energy prices to address the problem on the other hand. Now, Jake said there's no domestic political support for Kyoto. I don't think that that's right. There are polls that show that people are aware of global warming and are concerned about it and do want to do something about it. I'd refer you to page 979 of your binder, where the University of Maryland Center for Research in Public Attitude, something like that, did a survey. It says, did a careful poll. One of their conclusions is an overwhelming majority of the U.S. public embraces the idea that global warming is a real problem that requires action. Now, unfortunately, once you then say, well, what if the cost is 5 cents a gallon of gasoline, 10 cents, 15 cents, the numbers who are enthusiastic about action start to drop off rather sharply. Many of them still are in favor of it, and up to roughly $30 a ton of carbon, you still get a majority in favor of action. But the problem hasn't really been posed adequately in that in those terms. And the current adverse political reaction to the recent increase in oil prices is quite instructive in that regard. The third chasm is between the technology optimists, these engineers who say that we can, there are technologies that exist out there, that if we just would only adopt them, that we can solve the problem for free, or we can actually save money by doing it, versus on the others, the pessimists who say that this will plunge the U.S. economy into a recession, and we dare not do anything. And between those two extremes, I think the economists are the realists, as I said, who think the costs are not greater than 0, but moderate. The fourth is the chasm between Americans and Europeans who have different attitudes towards international trading of emission rights. And if we were to agree to European wishes to cap the amount of trading, then the costs would go up sharply. And fifth, and maybe the most difficult on this list of 5 difficult political gaps that need to be bridged, is a gap between the United States and the developing countries regarding the necessity of their participation in any global plan to address climate change. We simply cannot address this problem without their participation. Now, there's a lot of resistance in part because developing countries assume that they're being asked to bear some burden to address a problem that they did not originally create, and that there are appeals to equity. Well, I think that would be inequitable if they were being asked to bear an economic burden to address this problem, but they are not. What we really have to focus on and talk about is that if the developing countries could be persuaded to accept targets that were in line with their business as usual path, then they would benefit from that, and we would benefit from that. Targets, business as usual targets, plus participation in a international trading scheme, so they would be paid to reduce emissions below their business as usual path. There would be economic benefits to them, because they would be only doing those reductions that could be made at lower cost than they'd be paid to do it. There'd be economic benefits to us, and there'd be environmental benefits to everybody. Those 5 chasms are so wide that I actually have to agree that there is some doubt that the Kyoto Treaty will be ratified and will go into effect. I think it's premature to give up on it, as many prominent economists have done. Whatever its flaws, I am prepared to argue that this is the only feasible route politically to addressing the problem. And in any case, it is the strategy we've currently got. Just one more sentence. I actually agree with Jake that if we don't go ahead and do this within the next few years, it will become too late. You cannot turn the energy economy around in 5 years. Our CEA estimates will become out of date soon if we do not enact the Kyoto Treaty, because they're predicated on the assumption that we start taking action in the year 2000.
Jake.
Well, Dan uses the word opponents to refer to people who think this might be costly, and there are certainly a lot of those out there, and I'm sure that you've got them well reflected in your booklet. Mm-hmm. But I consider myself somebody who thinks this could be quite costly, and I'm not an opponent. I think this is a serious problem. And my fear is that by having the short-term politics drive selections of targets and the like, we might mess it up at a critical stage of creating the institutions. My concern, I'll go back to my ham and cheese sandwich. My concern is time. It's not that we couldn't do this. It's not that it couldn't be relatively low cost to do this, at least this first stage of Kyoto. This is the first stage of a much bigger process, of course, but a much longer and more stringent requirement, much more longer and much more tough things to be done. But the difficulty in the current circumstance is that we've picked a set of targets that are not feasible given the time that's attached to the target. I won't go through it. I will ask you to imagine the conversion of a coal-fired power plant, which requires new pipelines and such, and it requires permitting processes and the like, and just go through your mind how long it takes to do that, and assume that you don't begin to try to do that until 2005, and you have a target which is 2008 to 2012. That's the nature of the problem. That the timing is just off given the target level, or the target is too high given the timing. So it's just not going to happen. And the problem is that if you adopt the scheme, even if you did adopt the scheme with a target that's not feasible, then you take a chance of messing things up along the way, because you end up fuzzing the numbers, using creative accounting to get yourself out of a deeper political bind you've put yourself in. Final point is everything that's said about trading is true in terms of its ability to substantially lower the cost of this first round of reductions, because there are lots of cheap reductions in a number of other countries, and there's a lot of hot air in the Soviet Union, and if you could get that, you could make the costs a lot less. The question is, how long does it take to create those types of trading systems up to a level that even approximates what's going on in these economic models. And that's a debate we should have and you should have. My view of this is that it takes time. It's going to be a very messy process. It's already underway. There are already trades. I get magazines from trading organizations. The exchanges in various countries are already moving to try to get hold of this market. So it's not that it's not happening. It is happening. But the creation of the market that functions at the level that it's assumed when you have these cheap numbers is going to take a long time, not 5 to 10 years.
Dan.
Okay, I'd like to use my 2 minutes here to address this question of how tough are these Kyoto targets really anyway. And I don't think they're, when you look into the details, quite as difficult as has been suggested in particular by Jake and Mike. First of all, U.S. emissions, I think, and we have a bit of a factual dispute here, but I think that the latest data shows that U.S. total greenhouse gas emissions as controlled by the Kyoto Protocol are about 10% above 1990 levels this year, or will end up maybe a little bit higher than that, or say 10% above 1990 levels last year. Last year we have complete data. And very interestingly, for the last 3 years, the growth in emissions has been much lower than anybody predicted. Less than 0.5% per year, while economic growth has been 3 to 4% per year. Nobody's model, including the technological optimists, predicted that level of decoupling between economic growth and emissions over this period of time. It's not entirely clear what the cause is. There's some clearly short-term effects with respect to weather, although those warm winters may be coming a long-term predictable effect. There's some short-term things in terms of steel production in the industrial sector, but it looks like there's also a long-term component, in part at least driven by the so-called new economy, driven by efficiencies in business-to-business e-commerce, for example, and less so to business-to-consumer e-commerce. So there's something going on in the data over the last 3 years that we don't really understand, but I believe it suggests that for the U.S., we're actually doing better than we thought we would be as of now. What about internationally? The UK just last week published their detailed plan for meeting their target. UK emissions are actually 15% below 1990 levels today. Their target is 20%. I've already used 2 minutes? Whoa! All right, let me just make one other point. So Russia, 40% below 1990 levels today. No sign that their emissions are going up. Their target is several 100 million tons above what their expected emissions are in the year 2010. It's unclear to what extent that so-called, what we call hot air, will enter the trading system, but I think it's safe to say that at least some of it will. And that means if you look at Annex 1 as a whole, we're actually much closer to being on track to meet the Kyoto target than you might expect.
Thanks, Dan. Time flies when you're having fun. And to Mike Toman, finally.
You can tell that cost is important. Couple of points on that. I find myself maybe half agreeing with Dan on some of the points he made in his 5 minutes. I think that there has been over-optimism, both in the CEA administration study and in other studies outside the government, on what the international flexibility mechanisms will produce. I think it's a near certainty that we won't see cost savings of the type the models indicate because of the real-world limits on how those will work. On the question of sort of the bottom-up cheap tons that Dan mentioned, I tend to be somewhat skeptical of that, but the beauty of something like the safety valve approach that I've suggested is that we'll find out. If there's a lot of it, we'll know. And so I'd actually like to see that experiment start soon and have us learn something. On the flexibility and stringency interconnections, again, I'd say that if there are practical limits as well as political debates about how these flexibility mechanisms are going to work, then that may not be the way out if it turns out that it is as costly as the sort of middle ground thinks, never mind the extremists. That again suggests that if we have a way to maintain aspirations but balance them off against some insurance against excess costs. This is not blowing off the problem, but rescheduling it in some productive way so we can hang on to the long-term goal of reducing emissions, but not have a train wreck in terms of opposition to doing it in the short term. That strikes me as a good thing. Last point, equity. What a can of worms. It's clear to me from my dealings, limited as they are, with some people in the developing world, that they just see that issue entirely differently than we do. They see us as basically wanting to crowd out their long-term development space. I'm not suggesting that that's right, but I'm suggesting that that's an issue that's going to be a very difficult one to resolve, and not one that we're necessarily going to solve just by having the CDM, though I'm a strong proponent of that mechanism.
Thank you, Mike. And now we're going to go to questions from all of you. We're going to alternate. If someone, you can use both microphones. I don't think there are any mics on the second level today. So just, if you could just go to the microphones here. And I would just ask that you keep the questions real brief. More importantly, I ask our panelists to keep the responses very brief, because we'd like to get as many questions and answers as possible. You were first, so we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Katie Klingon-Smith. You all mentioned the importance of economic implications in developing countries, and it seemed more than anything the emphasis here was on the politics from the United States perspective of encouraging that cooperation. I'm curious if any of you could add some to the economic and development considerations within those countries, and at a more concrete level what the United States could do to address those economic issues, particularly within the major developing countries like India and China that we're supposed to address in this exercise.
Anyone want to comment on that? Respond? What the United States could do vis-a-vis India and China to make them more interested in participating. Is that a fair summary? Yes.
I mean, there is a real barrier here, a real block. In the past COPs, there's been a resistance from the developing countries to even putting on the agenda some topic that they thought might lead eventually to some discussion about the possibility of them taking on targets. I mean, they're just completely allergic to it within that category. On the side, we've made some progress of persuading some countries, Argentina and a few others, to accept targets, but that has been very much on the side and an exception. The representatives of the developing countries make points which are quite valid, that the industrialized countries caused the problem, and they're often still stuck in this mode of let's give emissions on an equal permits on an equal per capita basis, which would amount to just effectively huge transfers from the rich countries to the poor countries, and it's just a complete non-starter from the viewpoint of the rich countries, the United States in particular.
Jake, briefly.
Well, I think CDM will not necessarily be very large in terms of the total carbon or other greenhouse gas problem going out over many years, but it may be very important for some developing countries, some companies, and for encouraging participation. So getting a CDM where the transactions costs don't kill the whole program would be very, very important. Second, I think one of the ways that may attract developing countries into the system is to have a functioning trading system where they can sell something, where it becomes in their interest to join. And so I think that a lot of the potential of drawing them in depends on the creation of an effective trading system in the other countries as a possible lure.
Thanks. Let's go to the next question over here, please.
Yeah, I was wondering about the domestic trading scheme that you're talking about with the price ceilings. Can you foresee any problems that might occur with that system, companies taking advantage of waiting until the price goes up or something? I don't know.
I'm sorry, could you just say the second half of the question?
I was just trying to guess a way in which it might not work, but I'm not economically sophisticated enough to know how it might exactly.
Maybe to paraphrase the question, change it a little bit, is could you more carefully in a minute explain the nature of the safety valve mechanism,
Perhaps.
How it works?
Okay. This is something that would be superimposed on a system that basically has a way of tracking all the carbon that enters the energy system in the United States, and by restricting that acts in effect the way a carbon tax would to reduce the demand for the use of these fuels. So you'd have these tickets that would sort of be stapled to a barrel of oil and so on. Now, we wouldn't know in a pure trading system what price might meet the target we set. So what would happen in practice with the safety valve is that any time the price went above whatever the ceiling was, the government would throw open a window and sell more permits. And in effect, the market for the permits would always clear at that ceiling price or below if there's a lot of cheap stuff. The problem from an environmental point of view, if you look at it that way, is that we're not going to hit a fixed target necessarily. We're going to at best hit it or maybe fall short of it. But I don't think that there's any particular gaming or other things that could subvert it in terms of functioning within the domestic system. There are bigger issues internationalizing it. If you have different safety valves, you create a lot of economic distortion. But domestically, I don't think there's anything that would cause it to founder.
There's no way to drive up the prices so that more permits would be issued?
No, because a competitive market, nobody can sort of drive up a price unilaterally. I mean, you might try to imagine that the utility industry would form a cartel to do that, but it's not going to work in practice. It'll be competitive.
Jake has a comment on this.
I'm enormously admiring of this idea, and I wish we could figure out a way to push it through. Because I said earlier that it's hard to imagine an alternative architecture, but this is an alternative architecture. Or it's the elements of one, and the problem that would need to be overcome, in my view, is the charge that this is a carbon tax, because it is very creative and it's not exactly like a carbon tax. But the argument will be made that if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck, then it's probably a duck, because what you have is a circumstance where people would have to buy permits from the government if they were over quota, which is a carbon tax. That would be a good idea in my view, but the problem is to overcome that political opposition.
Before we go to the next question, I'll mention that within those 1,200 pages, there's both a paper by Mike Toman and his colleagues on the domestic version of this mechanism you asked about, and there's also a paper by McKibben and Wilcoxon on an international version of a very similar kind of mechanism. Next question, please.
My name is Doug Shipman. I'm curious about the enforcement. We had just sort of breezed over it as we went along, but from an economic perspective, what are the costs of enforcement, especially of a tradable system that includes the less developed countries? Or in general, how do we think about those when we think about the costs of trading?
So how should we think about enforcement costs, particularly in the context of developing countries and as it relates to trading? Who is interested in?
I'll take
Mike.
Well, think about the clean development mechanism, because it's probably the most vivid example of this. You're talking about doing project-based endeavors to shave off emissions to relative to some counterfactual baseline. You'll need to have people inspecting, sort of reviewing this. There'll have to be a bureaucracy that sort of evaluates whether these projects are really done or whether it's all a sham. There's no question this is going to be expensive and difficult to administer. As Jake said before, you want to get those costs down as low as possible, but they're going to be there. They're going to be substantial. None of our models are really very good at taking that into account yet. There's a whole debate about how you want to have generic versus project-specific approaches, and that would more than use up all of the rest of our time. So let me just say that they're a real issue, and we need to have creative thinking about how to have these mechanisms work smoothly without a huge amount of project-by-project analysis, or else you'll kill the system.
Yeah, I just, on the international trading side, at the national level versus the project case that Mike was talking about, there's another issue, which is essentially having an international trading regime allows countries, if you don't restrict it, potentially to export non-compliance. So compliance is an issue and difficult to deal with in international negotiations in any case. The trading system could exacerbate it, but it could be built with rules that tend to ameliorate that problem. I mean, the example to think about is, say, Kazakhstan does not have an effective emission monitoring regime, and they sell a lot more tons than they really have to spare. And in effect, those excess tons, which on one level, if there was no trading, they might miss their target, but they wouldn't cause anybody else to miss their target. By trading, they can expand that and kind of inflate the whole budget. So there are ways to build in mechanisms in terms of buyer responsibility or mixed responsibility if somebody goes over their target, but it does need to be thought about.
Let me just highlight what Dan said, that you'll find in your briefing book a discussion of the issue of buyer versus seller liability in permit systems, or various combinations thereof, which is precisely what Dan was highlighting, and Jeff's got a point.
Yeah. There is sort of a continuum. We currently have a system for SO2 trading among U.S. utilities that works very well, is enforced very, very well, and has helped reduce costs a lot. implementing Kyoto targets for the whole U.S. domestically would be a lot more complicated because there's just lots of sources, and that's, among other things, it's important, I think, to do it upstream rather than downstream to have some hope of enforcement. But I think it can be done, even if not quite as well or thoroughly as SO2 trading. Once you go internationally, it becomes another step more complicated. And there's certainly lots of problems. I mean, one possibility is some rogue country just printing up a bunch of permits and selling them off, and then saying, oh, sorry, you know, we missed our targets. And I, for that reason, would favor what's sometimes called an empty tank provision, that once you sell a lot of permits, that's sort of all that you've got, and then it's no longer plausible you can meet your targets, that you get shut down. There are definitely problems with enforcement. But by the standard of international treaties, and we can't, there's no hope, no prayer of addressing this problem without an international treaty. By the standards of international treaty, I think this is sufficiently enforceable to be worth doing and to make a lot of progress on.
Thanks. Next question.
Yes, my name is Stuart Rosenberg. This is a question for Professor Toman. Professor Jacoby, in his essay on page 147, mentioned that several non-participating countries supported opt-in provisions, but that China and India opposed them. And because of opposing them, there was no opt-in provisions included in Kyoto. And then on page 140 of the briefing book, there was mention that China and India have been intransigent in including opt-in provisions. The question is, how specifically would you implement a clean development mechanism program for developing countries given this potential intransigence?
Mm-hmm. Well, those are the two best countries to think about, so it's appropriate to talk about them. The short answer is that the intransigence you see in the foreign ministries is not where the economic development managers of these two countries are. This I know a little bit from my direct contacts in India and also from indirect contacts in China. They're coming around. It's slow. It's not easy, but they will come around. This comes back to the earlier question as well. A lot of what's going on here is really going to be driven by globalization and the desire of both of these countries to get on a growth bandwagon, to really improve their own lot. That's going to drive them to a lot of investment in restructuring energy and so on if they want to succeed. That's going to draw them in turn to the CDM because it's going to be in their self-interest to do so. The kind of geopolitics that they've hidden behind before can't last forever if they really want to get on the program here.
Just point, I mean, there's a distinction that you have to make between intransigence at the national level within national targets versus project-based mechanisms like the CDM. I mean, I think, and part of that is Jeff Frankel's idea, you know, have a target that is exactly what business as usual would be and traded from. That'd be great if anybody knew what their business as usual emissions would be. But particularly in developing countries, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in that. And so there's, I think, understandable reluctance to guess in a way that could hurt them if their economic growth was higher than expected, for example. Argentina has addressed that somewhat creatively in their proposal using something that's indexed to GDP, for example. This is actually the square root of GDP worth looking at. There's obviously an environmental risk on the other side. If you guess too high, you create more hot air in the system. The CDM is an attempt to kind of avoid that problem by looking at it on a project-by-project basis. It doesn't really avoid the problem because you have project baselines that you have to guess about, and those are unknowable too, but at least the scale may be more manageable.
Our fellow panelist, Jeff Frankel, would probably be too modest to mention the fact that that creative mechanism that you described was one that he originally developed and proposed when he was at the Council of Economic Advisors, and that fortunately, and is in the package. I'm going to go to the next question and then brief responses. Yeah.
Yes, Henry Jacoby seems to be saying that having a system of having the targets and timetables without a system of trading and international participation seems to be putting the cart before the horse. First, is that accurate? And if so, I'd like to hear what the rest of the panel thinks about that.
Well, let me just say, I don't see that one comes before the other. That is, I don't see how you could start a system of trading without some incentive to create the system and to trade, which means you'd have to have some sort of a target and timetable system ahead of, as a precursor for that. My concern is that we've set targets that politically are not going to be attainable, and I'm raising the question of what should we do about that in the short run to be able to keep the system alive and not mess it up in the short run. But you couldn't do one without the other.
I'm going to go to the next questioner because we're running out of time, and so I'm going to try to get these two people both. Yes, to you.
Hi, Kate Hampton, MPP 2, sorry. My problem with emissions trading is that if you want it to be effective, you have to trade between cost minimizing agents, which suggests between industry trades at the international level. And in order for a liability regime to be successful, you're going to increase the verification cost because there will be something approximating a project-based review of how, especially if you've got some form of buyer and seller liability, you're going to have the different companies checking out what each other are doing, and that's approximating project level scrutiny. And if you have the trades between countries, then as Robert Staben's paper points out, then you're not going to have the cost minimizing agents in action, and you're therefore not going to get the marginal cost reductions that you want. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Mike's got his eyebrows raised.
Good question. My answer to this is that within Annex 1, if we're talking about Annex 1 trading, I think we should have seller liability in pre-qualified countries. Countries that can demonstrate, unlike the Kazakhstan example, that they've got their act together, that they can regulate their own domestic entities, then I'm willing to let the system go. If they can't, they're not in.
Does anyone else want any other?
Just to say that the administration policy is to have trading between individual agents, at least in the United States, who would be firms doing the trading internationally, but you have the enforcement, the monitoring and the enforcement to make sure that each country has met its standards. That's at the national government level under the Kyoto Protocol.
And just one other thing is that you'd have to keep track of the permits at the national level, but you can't have a market operating if every permit is going to have a name on it, that this is the GM permit or this is the American Electric Power permit. That is, I think that's one of the complexities that's now being debated, is how you deal with it at the two levels, because you have a national commitments and industry level traders.
I'm tempted to join the discussion at this point, but I'm going to resist that since everyone's already heard from me in a lecture setting, and we'll go to you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Maite Oosterveld. I was wondering if you could, if there are economic reasons for the EU to be against full trading, and linked to that, when you talk about costs, like you have, are you talking about total global costs or just American costs?
Yeah, well, let me take one shot at it. I mean, I think you could make some arguments, and people have made arguments about them trying to get economic advantage. The environmental argument against, for the EU kind of restrictions on trading focuses on the issue of hot air. And I don't think their proposal gets at that directly. But to the extent that there's an allocation to Russia that's probably several hundred million tons more than they could possibly emit, then allowing that to come into the market and paying for it, essentially you're reducing the cost, but you're reducing the environmental effectiveness. So you're not actually reducing the cost per ton of carbon actually held out of the atmosphere compared with business as usual. So my view is that the issue of hot air needs to be addressed, and that's probably a more fruitful, and won't be done completely, but a more fruitful way of focusing the discussion rather than a sort of arbitrary ceiling.
Anyone else on this? Yeah,
well, what I've heard from at least the French, and I think this is true in some other cases, is they want the ability to raise money through a carbon tax or some other fiscal mechanism to continue to finance their welfare programs without killing their employment picture. And if we have cheap tons and they've got expensive tons, their carbon-intensive industry dies. So I think there are sort of competitiveness issues that are driving this as well.
Okay. Thank you. What I've asked the panelists to think about, I warned them about this an hour ago, was that for a closing question, I would like them to address the following. You have 2 minutes alone with the lead negotiators going into the 6th conference of the parties in The Hague in November, and you have the authority and the responsibility both to tell them whatever you want, to give them any advice you want in terms of the positions they ought to take and what they ought to do and what they ought to be pushing for and how they think they ought to think about this problem. What would you say to those negotiators in those 2 minutes that you have? And we're going to go in the same order we've been going all along, alphabetically, starting with Jeff Frankel.
I think I can do it in 1 minute. That we can't accept limits on international trading. If the alternative is no agreement, then we got no agreement because it's dead anyway if we have limits on international trading. That's number one. Number two, we need participation by developing countries. There's some problems there of knowing how to put it into the Kyoto Protocol, because the original Berlin Mandate says that the developing countries don't have to accept targets on the same timetable as the industrialized countries. But we have to find a way to do that. And my proposal would be to aim at targets for developing countries that is close to business as usual. You could aim slightly below it and still have economic benefits for everybody. As Dan mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you want to aim at the center of the band to maximize the chance that you'll end up with the developing countries actually at close to business as usual, and both sides will benefit from the gains from trade.
Jake Jacoby.
I would say hold the line on the trading and try to get a scheme that could work over time. Second, pry open the issue of targets and timetables. We're not going to ratify this treaty in the United States, and so this treaty as it stands is not going to go into force. And therefore use COP6 at the degree that you can, and it will be, of course, extremely contentious question. Use COP6 as an opportunity to open this question. It won't be resolved there, but open the question, because otherwise we're headed down a dead end. Second, to follow what Jeff Frankel was saying on trying to pry open this question of developing country accession. And I think the way to do that is to try to run with the Argentina proposal, not to try to get general agreements on general rules, perhaps try to begin some discussion at that level on general principles of when countries might be asked or expected to take measures. But open up, pry open the question of voluntary accession. And, that's not a COP6 topic, but my advice would be to try to use COP6, which has a very narrow agenda, to pry open these other questions.
Thanks. Dan Lashoff.
Well, my advice is somewhat different, I think. I would start by saying that this is consistent, but a different take to what Jake Jacoby said. Fudging it isn't the path to ratification. Undermining the integrity of the emissions trading system will undermine confidence in those mechanisms for the long term, and so finding ways to do creative accounting and fudge the system is not the way to achieve ratification. Ultimately, you're going to need a strong environmental constituency to ratify it, and making the agreement meaningful in order to get it ratified is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. There must be a better term for that. That's number one. Two, I'd say focus on the CDM. Make it operational as quickly as possible. It's the most viable, real mechanism on the table for engaging developing countries. If we can, in my view, develop standardized methodologies, at least for a limited range of project types, we can get some real action going. It's a way both substantively and politically to handle the developing country participation issue in the near term. And so focus on what's doable and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Mike Toman.
3 points. Push back on the EU with respect to their attempts to limit trading, but give them something that makes it possible for them to leave happier than we've given them. That would be the second point, which is U.S. leadership in taking on some kind of a modest but accelerating carbon reduction program centered on a safety valve. If we have $25 a ton carbon, that's not just a ceiling, it's also a floor. It provides at least some assurance that the Europeans aren't going to be left standing alone and we walk away. And I would try to internationalize that, as I say. And third, we're driving the developing countries into the arms of the EU and against our interests in the United States by demanding too much from them too quickly in terms of participation. I also like the Argentine idea and think that's a topic for discussion. But at COP6, I would put much more emphasis, as Dan has suggested, on getting a CDM going that really can serve developing country interests. They don't care that it makes our carbon reductions cheaper, but they do care that it creates benefits for them. And I think there's ways we can pry them loose and make them partners in this rather than antagonists.
The final thing I want to mention is not of substance of the issue, but of process of who's up here on the panel. I've had the privilege in many different venues, sometimes serving on panels, sometimes in conversations, sometimes testifying, of being together with each one of the members of the panel over a substantial number of years. And from that experience, I know both of their excellence, but I also know how busy they are. And so I want to thank them on behalf of all of our part, really, for having taken time from those exceptionally busy schedules to be with us. And finally, I want to thank all of you for an excellent set of questions and your participation. Thanks.